I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
And I'm Matt Bernico. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
This week we are going to talk about K.H. Ting, a really amazing Chinese theologian and a guy who's had a lot of cool things to say about how Christians and communists ought to chat with each other. But before we do that, Matt, I understand you've been deep in the Our Christianity mines.
Yep, been in those mines looking for the treasure, and I think I found them. So if this is the first time you're listening to the podcast, cool. Welcome to it. Lately every week, Dean and I have been trolling the Our Christianity subreddit on reddit.com. Just for the really good and honest questions that need to be answered from the good Christian people of the internet. So this week I've got two questions, Dean, that I need you to answer, and it's really important that you give the good and biblical answer to these questions. So just do your best.
I always do
with the Bible. Last week we kind of talked a little bit about how in your Christian fanfic you don't want to pander toward carnality because that might lead you to sin. And I'm a little bit worried to read this question because I think it does pander toward carnality just a little bit, but I think we need to know the answer either way. So I'm going to just kind of ask it. So Dean, this user asks, a year ago, by the way, is Kama Sutra not right for the Christian marriage? Hang on, it gets better though.
During Holy Week, no less.
So it goes on, if a woman does not like the extreme fun plays of her husband, what should that man do?
Okay. Oh boy.
Yeah,
the extreme fun plays is troubling.
Yeah, the cool thing about the sentence is it's written like a real normal person would actually talk, so that's good.
This is the kind of question that you definitely bring up in your small group Bible study.
You gotta go
to all of your accountability partners.
You gotta go to Promise Keepers and be like, fellow men, what should I do? My Christian wife does not like the Kama Sutra.
Can I keep these promises? Can I make her make these promises? Oh boy.
Yeah. So the answers to this question are bad. So I'm not going to read them. But just throwing that one out there. So I don't know. Dean, that's where I'm going to come down this one. I don't know if the Kama Sutra is right for the Christian marriage. I couldn't tell you.
I'm going to say it's probably right for some Christian marriages. And maybe not the Christian marriage with a definite article.
Okay, fair enough.
The ideal Platonic form of Christian marriage.
Good. That's about, I think, as close as we can get without pandering too much towards carnality.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's one more big question that I think we can definitely answer because it's about economics. So I think that we're suited for this one. So the post is called, this is from 15 hours ago, by the way. This one's hot off the presses.
Wow.
Yeah, the post is called We Know WWJD, but how about HMWJT? This is the
HMWJD.
HMWJT. Yeah, I'm going to get this on a bracelet. So my question is, asks this person, how much would Jesus tip if he went to a restaurant? There's a pretty long, kind of rambling explanation of why this person thinks tipping is a big deal. But then he gets to the bottom. I assume it's a he. That's probably unfair of me, but probably. This user writes, "I know where Jesus stands on charity, but what about tipping? Tips are supposed to be rewards for jobs done better than required. They aren't charity." So, Dean, what do you think about this one? Well, we know what Jesus would do, but how much would Jesus tip?
I mean, every time Jesus sat down in the actual Olive Garden, the original Olive Garden, I believe it's recorded that he did tip at least 20% every single time. That's a biblical fact.
Okay. Yeah. You gotta, if you're gonna start cursing people's fig trees, you better tip them pretty well.
I'm just imagining, I mean, it is Holy Week, and today that we're recording it is Maundy Thursday, and that's the Last Supper, and I'm sure Jesus left a really good tip after that. They don't usually paint that part of the story, but I'm pretty sure that happened.
Yeah, I mean, parties over 10 have to tip more, so I would assume, right?
Yeah, gratuity is already included, so it actually doesn't help the theological debate, but...
Cool. Well, rather than tipping, let's talk about communism.
The ultimate tipping, where everyone gets tipped.
Full tip-unism.
So we talk a lot about communism and Christianity on this podcast. Communism, that's how I say it now, it turns out. just a new thing I'm trying out. We'd like to talk about like what Christians can learn from communism, how these two kind of traditions could go together or relate and that sort of thing. This week, instead of trying to figure out how to put this stuff together ourselves, we decided to get some advice from K.H. Ting, this Christian, like I said earlier, who was in China, who dedicated his life to trying to help Christians and communists cooperate to build a better world. Ting helped to lead a group that was called the Three Self Patriotic Movement. It was a state-sanctioned form, and still is a state-sanctioned form of Protestantism, named for its commitment to developing three principles, hence the Three Self name. So those are self-governance, so the Christian church should be governed by Chinese Christians. Self-support financially, so Chinese Christians shouldn't be getting funded by foreign missions and that sort of a thing. And self-propagation, that they shouldn't rely on foreign missionaries to expand Christianity, but should be able to do it indigenously themselves. So before we get to some of the things that Ting thought about this relationship between Christians and communists as a result of participating in this movement, there's a little more historical context that might bring us up to speed. So by the 1940s, when the communist movement was in full swing in China, a lot of progressive Christians greeted the revolution really enthusiastically. Not all of them, of course, but more than you would think, actually a surprising number of them. They ended up founding what was just at that time called the Three Self movement, not the Three Self Patriotic movement, in 1950, and it was founded as an explicitly anti-imperialist form of Christianity that was basically premised on trying to indigenize the faith in China. So the idea was that these Christians themselves felt that Christianity in China had been too tied to foreign interests, which often came right along with colonial interests. And they thought, well, if Christianity really is to be good news to the Chinese people, then it shouldn't come with capital strings attached. So they greeted the communist movement as also a way of liberating Christianity from its being tied down to those kinds of Western forces. In 1951, after the success of the revolution, the Religious Affairs Bureau of China invited a bunch of Protestant leaders to Beijing to found officially the Three Self Patriotic movement. What this meant basically was the establishment of a form of Christianity that was explicitly led by a revolutionary government, the People's Republic of China. And also it meant that a revolutionary government recognized the freedom of Christian expression within a certain legal framework or within certain parameters. After that came the Cultural Revolution, and there's a lot to be said about that and a lot that you could read about it. We're not really going to wade into that debate, but for Christians in particular, it meant a moment of pretty heavy and violent repression. So whatever you make of the Cultural Revolution wasn't great for Christians. Leaders of the Three Self-Patriotic movement were sentenced to hard labor or killed. After all the dust settled from that, though, the organization got refounded, and that's kind of where our story picks up. So K.H. Ting became one of the most creative and influential leaders in that movement, after the Cultural Revolution. He had participated in it earlier, but this is kind of when he really found his feet as a theologian and a person doing this kind of public theological work. So this week on the show, we decided to read some of Ting's writings to think through how he tried to honor the three autonomous principles of this movement, and also how he tried to bridge this divide between Christians and communists, and also what he thought it would take to cultivate a truly Chinese anti-imperialist form of Christianity. So we want to think through maybe what that would have to teach us in the West about Christianity and colonialism, and how Christians and communists might kind of work together in different projects or world projects.
So on this podcast, we've talked a lot about liberation movements and how Christianity has either bolstered them or learned from them. But this is kind of an interesting moment in the Christian Marxist dialogue, or that discourse between Christianity and Marxism, where it's a post-revolutionary society kind of working out how Christianity works. And it's also kind of doubly complicated because it's a place where Christianity wasn't wildly popular until later. So what's cool about K.H. Ting and learning about China and communism and Christianity all together is that you get to see some really interesting ideas get worked out. How would you make Christianity Christianity, but not not proselytizing, or not relying on foreign mission movements or something. So there's all these really interesting ideas floating around in K.H. Ting's writings, and honestly, I think they're pretty cool. K.H. Ting seems like a good guy with a lot of smart ideas.
Yeah, that's right. A good guy with a lot of smart ideas. He did, unfortunately, die in 2012, not that long ago, but he led a pretty extremely long life and left behind some cool writings. Some of them are hard to get your hands on. They have been he has a couple of collections of essays in English that have been translated, and there's a few books on him. We just found some really interesting articles that he had written in the 80s, which was pretty shortly after the Cultural Revolution. So we thought maybe that would be an interesting place to pick up, just to sort of see how Christianity both tried to rebuild in this communist society, and what it thought, or at least what Ting thought it could contribute to, the propagation of Chinese communism and socialism. So the first writing that we wanted to look at is called Retrospect and Prospect. It was written in 1980. It was given as an address to a national group of Christians. And Ting is basically trying to sort out what Christians could make of the recent past, and of the sort of history of Christianity in China more generally, and also how Christians could contribute to China now that it was post-revolutionary or in a socialist society. So Matt, what stuck out to you about this wild piece of writing?
Everything. There's so many good quotes and really interesting takes. So let's start here. So Ting writes, "The Chinese people have an anti-imperialist, anti-feudal revolutionary tradition, but Christianity entered China under the protection of Western powers during the period of Western colonial expansion into China. Our people have a hatred of the unequal treaties that were forced upon China, but the foreigners' right to do missionary work depended on these very same treaties. Thus, ever since the entry of Christianity into China, it was difficult for the Chinese people to accept this religion because, although originally good, it had become an appendage to the machine of Western aggression, having 1,001 links with colonialism and imperialism." So this sets the scene for exactly kind of what the tension is between Christianity and people in China. It's, not super surprising, right? We've looked at a handful of revolutionary movements, and this is always the sort of fear that people have in those movements, that Christianity is tied to the West, and chances are inviting missionaries into your country is a great way to get a CIA agent or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. We've talked about this in so many other situations, when we've talked about the DPRK, when we've talked about Cuba. It's the same kind of thing, that Christianity comes with capitalism, with Western capitalism, and though we might want to pull those two things apart, the fact of the matter is, historically, they don't get pulled apart. They come alongside one another, and if you want to save Christianity without the capitalism, you have to do a lot of work to actually figure out where the Western capitalism ends and where Christianity could begin differently, or something like that. And I think that's a really admirable project.
Yeah, totally. That's exactly what Althusser was saying just a few weeks ago, right? That like you have to disentangle these things if you want to have Christianity in socialism. You have to figure out how to talk about Christianity without talking about capitalism, and really seeing where those two things, become no longer synonymous with one another.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we can talk about this a little bit more with this quote that I pulled out, and I think what I love about this is just the language of it is really fascinating, because it shows that Ting is engaged in this extremely radical, deconstructive look at Christianity, but he also has a really interesting way of using the rhetoric of a more naive faith in Christianity to kind of make his points. And I guess I shouldn't even say using, like, he has a somewhat naive, like in a healthy way, form of Christianity himself. Like he has some somewhat conservative ideas about theology, but nevertheless this really, really radical political expression of it. So we'll get into more of that later probably, but just to maybe give a little taste of it, here's a passage from Ting. So he says, "Such a Christianity backed by foreign power lost its source of support after liberation. As it became isolated within China, Christianity faced a difficult situation. It was then that Chinese Christians discovered that God would not quench the dimly burning wick of Chinese Christianity, but would enable it to begin to shine forth. In God's providence, two things came to our aid. The first was the policy of religious freedom of the People's Republic of China, formulated by Chairman Mao and Premier Zhu. The second was the Three Self movement launched by the Chinese Christians ourselves. It may be said without reservation that these two are signs which show that God has not abandoned us, but has prepared us for a new opportunity and a new beginning." And what I love about this is, like, so many Christians invoke the language of God's providence or kind of signs of God, blessing the work of something. And it's oftentimes, like, put in the service of reactionary projects. But what Ting is doing, I think, is actually splitting a really interesting difference, because the sign is basically that Christianity isn't going to go away in this new social order. And by extension, that means that maybe Christianity has something to contribute to it. Like, it doesn't have to exist as just a dissident movement or a protest against the revolutionary society, but these might be signs that Christianity, as he says, has a new opportunity and a new beginning. And there's a real sort of, theological excitement or dynamism that's involved in that kind of claim, even as it draws off of this, pretty interesting, like, banal or average Christian belief, or Christian form of rhetoric.
Okay, so we have this sort of like proclamation or like articulation of providence of, God not extinguishing the flame of Chinese Christianity. And that's interesting. So I think, like, when you start talking about Christianity in China, and especially like in a socialist project, the first thing that people want to usually ask about or talk about is the ways that communists are atheists. And Ting has a lot to say about that as well, and about how the freedom of religion kind of plays into that. So Ting says this: "Communists, being atheists, how can they also advocate for the freedom of religion? There was a time when many of us raised this question, but after many years of observation and learning through experience, we do not feel that it is such a difficult thing to understand. Communists are forthright. They do not cover up their view of religion, but bring it out in the open for all to see. There are parties and politicians in the world who make use of religion for their own ends, while making a big show of their respect for the church." This sounds like some people I know. "And their assistance to the faith. Because the Communist Party does not wish to make use of any religion, it can forthrightly express its view of religion in no uncertain terms. We are completely free to not accept the Communist Party's religious outlook. But this should not suggest that we all oppose all Communist Party points of view. For example, it would make no sense for us to oppose the Communist Party proposal of the United Front." Okay, so this is cool, right? Like, like if you read the discourse about China and religion and like the persecution of Christianity is one that never stops, and it's even going to this very day. And we probably won't really talk about it because that's not the point of this episode. But in this like discourse about the persecution of Christianity in China, and I mean just like in Asia in general, you hear people put scare quotes around like communists and like how they're an atheist government or whatever, which is like really interesting because like, they're trying to play up an antagonism that, a journalist thinks exists between atheists and Christians. or like a state that is not endorsing any religion or something in Christians. And the way Ting lays it out here, though, is good because it demonstrates that, like, atheists, but like specifically communists, don't care about what you believe. They care about the material reality. And if you don't agree with like their religious outlook, like, that's fine as long as you don't like reject everything else, So it's cool. It just shows you that like a scare quote atheist government can like not be terrible about religion.
Yeah, I think that's really what's so amazing about Ting to me too, is that like he's able to articulate how Christians can actually have a distance from the Communist Party in some ways. Like they're not atheists. Christians are not atheists, whereas the Communist Party does have a policy of atheism. But at the same time, that distance doesn't mean an absolute distance. It's just a difference of opinion on this or that issue. And it doesn't preclude them from finding out ways that Christians could actually uniquely contribute to the communist project in ways that, make sense for Christians to do it, like on their terms. Hence this proposal for a united front, that's common among communists. I think that's really neat. In this same article, Ting talks about patriotism in particular as being like one thing that the Three Self movement has really kind of done well. And I think it's worth talking a little bit more about that because it's a really fascinating and somewhat like jarring thing, I think, for Christians in the West to read, especially where like patriotism and especially like nationalism or whatever are dirty words for good reasons. But Ting has kind of a different perspective on it. I mean, the thing that he is part of is called the Three Self Patriotic movement. So that already signals a difference. And I'm just going to pull out two quotes here that are really interesting. So he says this, patriotism is a good word. Moses, Daniel, and many other prophets in the Bible were patriotic. In Western countries, however, abuse of this word has caused many righteous people to loathe it, so that as soon as they hear the word patriotism, they think of national chauvinists who bully weak nations, of those diehards who wave banners for reactionary governments, crying, "This is my country, right or wrong." As for us, we would see first of all what a country has wrought for its broad masses before we make any evaluation of it. And then a little bit later, he goes on to say, this Christianity, the Christianity that he's advocating, does not take European and American Christianity as the norm, but it is also not anti-foreign. While affirming the universality of Christianity, we understand that Chinese Christianity cannot talk of making contributions to world Christianity unless it rids itself of its colonial nature, ceases to be a replica of foreign Christianity, does not antagonize or dissociate or alienate itself from the cause of the Chinese people, but joins them in that cause, plants its roots in Chinese culture, forms a Chinese self, and becomes a Chinese entity. So I think what's really important about this is like nationalism and patriotism, like I said, are importantly bad words in the West, and it's probably good that they are. But in the history of socialism and world communism, there's a much more complicated legacy going on there, and Ting helps Christians, I think, understand what is actually being said. Like, in order to decouple from the ways in which actually Western nations have really colonized Chinese forms of Christianity, they need to figure out a way to identify with the kind of communism that's happening there. So, like, he'll use the phrase of, like, what we need is a Christianity with Chinese characteristics or something. I think that's a really fascinating thing for Western Christians to wrestle with. It's something that Cornel West actually challenges us to do in that same article we talked about a long time ago, Religion and the Left, where Cornel West said, a lot of Marxists don't understand that, like, religion is a different thing for socialists and communists in colonized or oppressed places, and so is nationalism, and so are these other kinds of terms that make some Marxists or some people on the left shudder a little bit. And I mean, exactly what to say about that, I don't know. But it's fascinating that Ting feels the need to really, express this as like, this is an important thing for the Three Self movement, and it's important that the Three Self movement has made Chinese Christians more patriotic, has made them identify with the Chinese project more directly. And yeah, I mean, I think it's just kind of worth like complicating how we feel about those terms.
Yeah, I think it's cool because it kind of explicates like why, like the pronouncement of like a Christianity with Chinese characteristic or something explicates like why this would be so weird if we went the other direction. Like if we were in the United States, like it explicates why like this would be so gross.
Right.
Because like I can imagine like some good intentioned but like weird opinions from evangelicals who would just be like, no, you don't need a Chinese Christianity. We don't need an American Christianity. Sorry, I don't mean to like use a stereotypical voice, but I did. I didn't mean to, but I did. Right, like you just need the gospel. You don't need any type of like specific nationality in front of your Christianity. It's all the same, just because of Jesus, and that's the way it goes. It's a universal reality or a universal religion or whatever. But like I think that demonstrates the ways that like like Christianity being sort of like a universal religion to evangelicals in the West is an example of the ways that like evangelicalism or Christianity in the West just in general is like a thoroughly American religion that has already been like Christianity is are always already Christianity with American characteristics in so many ways. So this is cool because it helps you think through why that's so weird.
Yeah, I think it's also an interesting challenge to the sort of post-liberal and like Hauerwasian sort of vibe.
Yeah.
Which is like, we've talked about it on the show before, but it's right to challenge American identification, or identification between Christianity and the United States government or U.S. patriotism and that sort of thing. Like, that's good. But the principle of opposing all forms of national identity or identities that go beyond Christianity is really, really problematic, I think. And somewhat, definitely like influenced by virtue of being formed in the United States. Whereas like in a place like China, it's actually very important for Christians to figure out how to participate in the national project to the extent that they can, which isn't to like give the nation of China or the state of China like a free pass to do whatever it wants and you just kind of always sign on the dotted line. Like, that's not what Ting is arguing for either. But it's the idea that you should actually commit yourself to real material projects in the world, rather than kind of be held back by like abstract principles or something. And yeah, I think it's just a good challenge for all Christians in the West to think through what Ting actually means by something like patriotism.
Yeah, totally. Well, speaking of real material projects in the world that aren't communism, here's one. Here's one that Ting has a lot to say about, and we'll return to a handful of times. Okay, so Ting goes on to say that, however, there are anti-China organizations abroad which wantonly proclaim an underground evangelism and raise money for their own designs. They claim to establish in China their so-called underground churches. Let it be asked, if they indeed have no ulterior motives and are not doing some illegal business, why must they go underground? Some leaders of these organizations live very corrupt lives. Their actions are not worthy of the word evangelism. For the sake of protecting our church from impurity and of safeguarding our national security, we must heighten our vigilance over their use of religion to make money, to launch anti-China propaganda, and to carry out their subversive plots against us. Okay, so you've probably never heard of K.H. Ting before, and you've probably never heard of the Three Self movement. But if you've ever heard of Christianity in China, you've probably heard of house churches or the underground church. I know that like even at my school, like I've heard this narrative 100 times, if not more. But this is an interesting articulation of like why it's a bad thing, right? Like that the underground churches, if they were like just regular churches, like why wouldn't you just go to the regular church? Why would you like have this other secret church if not for like some kind of illicit action? And I think that concern, I think to people in the West it sounds paranoid, but I think it's not actually. I think like especially in the 80s, I mean, like, you know, it's still during the Cold War and China is a very scary kind of place or whatever. You know, they're communists in all senses of the word. So to be a little bit suspicious toward underground churches that might be set up by people who don't have China's best interests at heart is not surprising.
Yeah, for sure. And also, like, it just is true that Western powers use Christianity to infiltrate other countries. That's like a real thing that happens. And Western Christians also often understand themselves as like people trying to liberate, the poor oppressed people of other countries from their like socialist governments. So in that sense, like, they're responding to a legitimate threat to the state. Whether you think that threat is good or bad is kind of a different question. Like, if there was like a movement of house churches in the United States that was determined to create a socialist revolution, and they were like doing everything in their power to disseminate like communist propaganda, like, you better believe the U.S. government would be cracking down on it pretty hard.
Yeah, I mean, they'd at least send like some secret police to the meetings or whatever, for sure.
Yeah,
I mean, like, I think that's a good example though, right? Like, that in the United States, if this is like what would happen if there were underground churches of secret communist Christians or whatever, this is the same thing would happen. I think it's important to point out. But
right,
for different
right.
reasons, right? Like,
yeah.
all
right, well, maybe we should talk about there's lots more to be said about this particular essay, which is really amazing and a cool kind of historical artifact, but we should talk also about this really neat article that Ting wrote called Theological Mass Movements in China, which is kind of like his way of thinking about the history and presence of Christianity in China, but also like Christianity sort of more generally or globally, and just trying to work out what would it mean to think through Christianity's role as part of like a people's movement and not just an abstract set of ideas and beliefs or something, even though Ting has a lot of those himself. So lots of really neat things here, but the key is that he's trying to describe how Chinese Christians have tried to find their own path in theologically undergirding their own faith.
Yeah, so after the revolution in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party assumed that religion would just fade away after the revolution. This is like this is what they always think. This is what communists always think. But like, listen, this is what they're wrong about. Sorry, communists. That's the self-critique there, I guess. So in light of religion not just fading away, Christians who were committed to the communist project but were still Christians decided to, well, either work with the party to determine a framework of like how they can do like a Chinese iteration of Christianity, or they joined sort of the reactionaries, and that's the sort of two paths that Ting lays out in this next essay. He kind of goes out of his way to explain that like there is like actually some nuance here. It's not just like Christians either decide to be like cool or lame, but like that they either some of them found like the revolutionaries incredibly inspiring and they joined them during the revolution, or some of them like didn't find this to be a good thing at all and they went a different direction, right? So it's not like I guess the point is that like the Christians were not like on one side or the other, but they were on both sides, and they had to kind of like figure out how they wanted to work out being caught between these two things. So yeah, I don't know. This is how Ting describes it. Caught in between, Chinese Christians all over the country started to do theological reflection on their own. It was a mass movement seeking theological reorientation, involving tens of thousands of Christians restudying the Bible in relation to social changes around us. So, like, I don't know, a big revolution happened in society, and they have to, like, figure out where Christians are going to be in it and, like, how they're going to still live their lives, right? And it was a massive, like, it was of massive interest to Christians, you know, across the country. And that's why Ting thought it was a good idea to sort of, like, formulate something within the framework of the party, so that like Christians could not just be persecuted or not just fade away, but that they could have a place to participate in the new society that they've created.
Yeah, I really love the way that Ting describes this, because like you said, he isn't just saying like, well, some people were right about it and they were revolutionaries, and some people were wrong and they were not revolutionaries. He is looking at the revolutionary crisis as exactly that, like a decision-making point. And he's just trying to explain that, like, this is a moment where Christians had to really, like, actively start thinking through together. And the way that he puts it, it just sounds like, this immensely kind of creative and crazy sort of moment where Christians were faced with having to reevaluate what they believed about their own faith in light of the social situation that was occurring. And I think what I've admired most just learning about Ting, both in preparation for this episode and in some research I've been doing lately, is he just feels like actually a very measured kind of voice. Like, he's clearly chosen a side in the revolutionary struggle, no doubt about that, but he doesn't, like, he's not like I don't know, annoying about it. Or like, he's not like rubbing it in, or, being super unfair about kind of where people are and that sort of thing. It's more like he's just like trying to solve a lot of problems. And I think that's really fascinating. It comes out in how he even describes like the revolutionary situation.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there like, I'm sure like amongst reactionaries there would be like the criticism that like, well, Ting, he's just a communist first and a Christian second or something. But I don't know, that's not the feeling I get reading him. He seems like he takes Christianity, even of the people who like didn't join the revolution immediately, pretty seriously. And yeah, I think that's something we can appreciate. So Ting is great, right? We've talked a lot about how good he is and like just he's fantastic and amazing. But listen, he's gonna say something bad next. And we should talk about it. It's not bad. It's just like not what I want him to say, but it's fine. We'll figure it out. Okay, so this is what he says next. China makes so much of 1949, the year of the people's liberation, that Christians elsewhere have wondered what Chinese Christians since 1949 think of liberation theology. So I read this part and I'm like, oh yeah, this is gonna be good, and it's just gonna be about how good liberation theology is, right? Wrong. It's good, but not as good as you think. So Ting goes on to say, we think very highly of liberation theology as a theology permitting and mobilizing Christians in Latin America to join the masses of people around them in their struggle for independence, democracy, and a more humane socioeconomic system. Our reservation is that much as we do see the urgency of taking over political power by the people in the third world from the hands of foreign intruders and despotic rulers, we in our situation do not see fit to absolutize liberation and make it the theme or content of Christian theology. So that's kind of an interesting take. So this is kind of like, well, it's like, the struggle is kind of over for them, I guess, is maybe how we could interpret this. And like, liberation is good, and I think they respect it apparently, but in their situation, they don't think that liberation is the full sort of content of Christianity. And like, I think that probably liberation theologians think that too, in a certain way, that, that there's something more than just like the political liberation of people going on in Christianity. But this is just like an interesting way to articulate that problem.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it kind of reads like actually a very conservative critique of liberation theology at the end here, especially. But it comes, like you said, after the struggle is over, or after the moment of liberation at least has passed. Whereas liberation theology itself is born out of places and contexts where the liberative moment has not yet occurred. So it's like a completely different sort of way of construing Christianity's role, I think, in the liberation of people. And I think it also probably has something to do with the material conditions, right? Like in China, Christians were never a force large enough to really make or break the revolution. Mm-hmm. Whereas in like Brazil and Peru and Nicaragua and, many, many other places, like without Christians, there's no liberation. You have to get the Christians on your side. And in that sense, it also makes sense that like the material conditions would also determine the theological moves that get made. So it's fascinating to kind of see Ting's position is kind of not from a position of like privilege, that's not how I'd want to put it, but from it's like the kind of theology that could only emerge, the day after the revolution rather than like the day before.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So he goes on to say some more stuff about liberation theology that's sort of interesting too. He says, we, especially in our post-liberation state of affairs, would hesitate to think that the poor, just because they are poor, are necessarily the bearers of truth. I don't think that liberation theologians think that either, but still. Okay. To make a messiah of the poor just because they are poor and to pit the poor against the rich without the guidance provided by correct theory is neither Marxist or Christian. So again, kind of parsing out that, like, I don't know, like some kind of rub that he sees with like that preferential option for the poor. But then I think maybe one of the ideas that actually makes this make sense to me comes right after that, and then we'll move on to something else. But finishing the thought on liberation theology, Ting says, if much of European theology helps believers live with the reality of world hunger, and liberation theology moves them to share in the struggle for overcoming hunger, we, in New China, are concerning ourselves with the evangelistic task of showing our fellow citizens to whom hunger is no longer the number one problem, that we do not live by bread alone. So,
Love it.
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting. And it's not as bad as I thought at first. But yeah, it's just exactly what you're saying, right? Like, liberation theology is a theological movement that means something in a specific place. But in China, it doesn't make as much sense, because the struggle is not over, but definitely different. And, working from a socialist perspective, the point isn't necessarily getting people fed, because that should already be happening. But it's like, what do you do when you're already fed?
Yeah, I'll say one more thing just about his comments about liberation theology and the poor, because I think that's a really interesting thing to zero in on. I feel like I sort of find myself between liberation theology and Ting here, because there are, like, oftentimes liberation theologians will say, to distance themselves from communism, what they're really responding to is the poor, not class struggle or something like that. And it's the poor who are the bearers of the truth in a real significant way. And Ting is making an interesting point by saying that you shouldn't really see the poor as just, liberators in and of themselves because they're poor, without the guidance of a certain kind of theory or something like that, if you're a Marxist. Like, that's actually a genuinely interesting point. And it's one that I'm sympathetic to, although I don't think that it, like, dispenses with liberation theology or something like that. But for me, that's always been the appeal of Marxism, is like, well, if, the poor or even the working class were kind of like liberators just in and of themselves, well, that, like, they're not doing it. So how do you explain that difference? It's like the weird version of Marxist theodicy or something. Why don't the masses revolt? And the Marxist way of talking about it is like, well, yeah, like, you've got to organize them in really particular ways. And I think sometimes liberation theology does sort of sidestep that question. Not always, of course. Definitely not always. Lots of liberation theologians who are very good at this. But sometimes it sidesteps that question by just sort of reverting to an idealized version of the poor as a kind of abstract entity in a way that, maybe could use a little bit of help from people like Ting or something.
Yeah, I could see that.
But it is overstated. I think that's totally true.
Yeah. Okay, good. Cool. So, wow, we've talked about 2 different Ting articles, and you start getting a feel for, like, kind of like what he's about and how he's answering some of these, like, questions about how Christianity works in a place that is, engaging in a big socialist project. So we want to talk about one more that kind of fleshes out some more of, like, the concrete ideas and drives home some more ideas about imperialism. So the last article we're going to talk about is called Concerning Theological Education in China. And to me, it's actually the most interesting one, because it's, like, not just about theological ideas, but is about, like, how you train people to do Christianity in this type of different environment. So, like how do you train people to be a part of the Three Self movement, right? Like, how do you get people who would just be pastors to, like, actually engage with the bigger ideas? Is kind of a hard thing. So, like Dean said at the top of the episode, the Three Self Patriotic movement is a type of Christianity that's oriented around the ideas of self-government, self-support, and self-propagation. And in this essay on theological education, Ting spends a lot of the time talking about self-propagation and how important it is to have, like, a sort of, like, a thoroughly Chinese type of Christianity that doesn't rely on external sources. And in doing so, that means that, like, Christianity might look a little bit different, but still, like, they're doing the work of thoughtfully disentangling it from capitalism and good for them. So Ting says this: we'd not just change old practices in theological education just for the sake of changing, but on the other hand, we'd not regard them as sacred. Self-propagation is the hardest of the three in our three self-emphasis. We need to take protective measures for the growth of the plant. This is comparable to the adoption by all countries of protective tariff to ensure the prosperity of national industries. We are not so foolish as to not want the benefit of advanced achievements in theological circles abroad, but we will certainly not allow thoughts from abroad to harm or control the theological efforts which constitute newborn things in China. And then he says, kind of concluding this thought, the time for the unconditional adoration of whatever is Western is over. So you can see this kind of like as a pretty important orienting idea for doing theological education in China, that like you need people to be able to think about religion if Christianity is going to happen there for sure. And they have to do it in a way that's not going to, always rely on Western practices, Western traditions, Western theological interpretations, and so on. So what you get here is a really important piece of the puzzle for Chinese Christianity.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, too, that he says self-propagation is the hardest of the three self-emphasis. Because, like, just thinking as a person who's been part of churches for most of my life, like, I always think that maybe, like, self-financial support would be the hardest, like, logistically, but actually it's the self-propagation, because that's the real ideological challenge, like, changing your entire consciousness. In fact, he goes on to say, we're departing from the Eurocentrism and U.S. centrism of the past. We're paying due attention to the history of the church in China. The latter should be something else than the missionary history in China, or part of missiology. We need to establish the truth on the basis of the facts when we deal with the question of the relation between the missionary movement and colonialism and imperialism. And I think that's pretty wild, right? That, like, self-propagation basically means trying to really do the hard work of, like, owning up to where Christianity has come along with these violent capitalist practices, and also trying to, like, pull apart Christianity from those practices in such a way that it could grow differently. Like, he always uses these plant metaphors, like, it needs to grow in Chinese soil, and it will grow differently in that way. I think that's just a really, really fascinating way of posing the problem. And yeah, I mean, like, I can't help but just feel like a lot of admiration for just the courage that it would take to, like, think that that's a problem that you could even address, and then to go on and, like, establish seminaries and, like, syllabi and even translations of the Bible in such a way that you would be trying to do this task communally together. Like, he talks quite a lot in the article about, like, all the strategies that they're using to try to uproot these kinds of things, like the Eurocentrism or U.S. centrism of Christianity, and to plant and cultivate something different. And I think that's, like, a really just impressive feat.
Yeah, I think so too. And, like, it's such an interesting idea that he frames it in terms of, like, a missiology. Because, I mean, that's what propagation is, I guess, right? That's how Christianity often thinks of propagation, is through the proselytization or like mission work or something, right? But this is a different type of mission work, like saying, no, sorry, you can't, you and your youth group can't come over here to China and, like, help us build a church or whatever. We're gonna do our own thing. I think it's pretty good. And honestly, it's, like, super disappointing that that Christianity in the United States, especially, is, like, so completely beholden to capitalism, or, like, also national chauvinism for sure, that, like, they couldn't just, like, see this as an invitation to, instead of, like, going, like, wanting to have, like, a mission trip or whatever, or, like, sending, like, actual missionaries, that they wouldn't just, like, give their money to the three self movement or something, right? Like,
yeah,
the problem is, or like the expression of national chauvinism is that, like, well, they can't actually just do this by themselves. Like, that's crazy. Self-propagation, no. They need, like, sort of like the white people that know about Christianity to go and tell them about how it actually works. So mission committees, listen up, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It's also really fascinating too, because for him, like, self-propagation also doesn't mean like just towing one line of Christianity, right?
Yeah.
Like, he emphasizes that there's theological diversity within a Chinese form, like an indigenously Chinese form of Christianity. But it has to be something different. Like, it has to be a plurality that's not the same as the plurality of like all the different kinds of Protestants in, you know, Europe or the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's exactly what he goes to next. That like it might seem like all of Christianity in China is replaced by like the Three Self movement, and also the Council for Christian Churches in China, and you know, they've made everything uniform. But Ting also works this out and is kind of like pretty quick to recognize how that's not actually the case. So he says Chinese Protestantism has already entered its post-denominational stage, i.e. denominational structures are no longer in existence, but in the matter of faith, worship, and spirituality, denominational characteristics have not been done away with. We are maintaining our differences, not obliterating them. We are working hard to implement the policy of mutual respect, a policy solemnly announced by the National Committee of the Three Self Movement and the China Christian Council. So, first of all, the term post-denominational stage is super interesting to me.
Yeah, same.
That you could just like not have Methodism or Anglicanism or Presbyterianism, but you just like, listen, we're all gonna still do those things, but just together.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty interesting idea. So, yeah, there's sort of like a rule for diversity going on for Christians in the Three Self Patriotic movement. He kind of articulates that rule more explicitly later when he says, we rather need to ask the majority to care for the minority, the leader to care for the subordinate, the teacher to care for the student. Only thus is unity served in the end and truth is reached. So it's this idea that like denominations are sort of like a Western formation of thought and tradition too, right? And like that's true. Like Methodism, Episcopalianism, and you know, all these different denominations are Christian formulations from the West. So why not let a Christianity grown in Chinese soil kind of figure out how they want to articulate those differences? And they figured it out. They can have a type of diversity while still maintaining like a unified idea of Christianity.
Yeah, totally. I should say, by way of aside, I won't go super far into this or anything, but like the story of Catholics is obviously different and separate from this. There's like a Catholic, an official state Catholic organization that for a long time was not recognized really by the Vatican in the way that it, you know, wanted to be, or in the way that like many Catholics wanted it to be. And a lot of that has changed in the last couple of years or whatever. So like Protestantism is probably the thing to underline. That's what Ting says, right? Chinese Protestantism is post-denominational, but Christianity by and large hasn't like, it's not like they've solved all the schisms of Christianity in China yet.
Right.
But who knows? Maybe they will.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, I don't think so. But he also deals with a pretty cool, like, common misunderstanding, too, I think, about, like, well, isn't this Christianity just kind of, like, a tool of Marxism being, like, cynically used to get people on its side or whatever? And he addresses that saying, contrary to the assumption on the part of some outsiders, there's no teaching of Marxism and Leninism in the curriculum of our theological training centers, which is actually crazy to me. I was surprised to learn that. In Nanjing, on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of Marx, we did have a lecture which clarified what in his teachings we ought rightly to appropriate from and what to disagree with. We did not approve of attempts to Marxicize Christianity or to Christianize Marxism. We help students see the groundlessness of atheism so that they can do work in apologetics, which is also very funny. We do not, however, make atheism our number one enemy whom we blame for every evil. And I think that's, like, pretty wild, too, right? This is actually, like, a way more nuanced perspective than I think even I would have assumed, just kind of thinking through all of this, if Ting hadn't just laid it out like that. I don't know. It's just, like, a fascinating way of marking the distance and the affinities between Christianity and Marxism and seeing these as ongoing dialogical projects. And also, again, like, you get a certain whiff of, like, Ting's kind of conservatism here too with respect to his Christianity, I think, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I mean, when I read this too, I was also sort of surprised that like they don't read Marx or Lenin or anyone else, you know, in these like in their theological training. But I guess like kind of you think about it within the larger context of society, that they probably just read those people other places, you know, like
Yeah, that's true.
they don't need to read them for theological education because they've read them in school or in other like avenues, which is like kind of different. It's actually a really different and weird difference between like the Christianity in China and the Christianity in like the United States or the West, because like in I mean, you know, it's, you probably wouldn't read Marx in seminary, but you might read some liberation theologians that talk about him or something here. So if you want in theological education in China, you don't have to read Marx, but in the United States in a graduate program, at least you probably would.
That is actually very funny. Well, all right. So I think we could kind of bring some of these insights home as we wrap up here. What I love about just learning about Ting and Christianity in China so much is the story is always so much more complicated than it first seems. And in this instance, especially, like the kind of Christianity that is being experimented with in China is something that I think has actually a ton to teach people in the West, both communists and Christians. Like for Christians, obviously, it has a lot to teach us about like the way in which Christianity has been part and parcel with imperialism and colonialism, and also how Christianity could maybe be disentangled from that. Like, that's a pretty encouraging thing to hear, that might be possible. And for communists, like, it has a lot to teach, of course, about how communists could relate to people of faith and what it would mean to actually fully embrace a kind of freedom of religion in such a way that, like, you saw people of faith as able to uniquely contribute to a society without, like, you know, agreeing on every single ideological point. Like, if we've got weird ideas about heaven, no big deal. I think that's a really important lesson as well.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, seeing how this can be worked out in a socialist project is good. I hope, if anything, it teaches socialists and communists that, like, religion is just not going to go anywhere, and that you can, like, deal with it in ways that are creative and interesting and positive. Thanks for listening to Magnificast. Hopefully this episode did not make you stumble too much towards carnality in the flesh with our opening questions about the Kama Sutra. And if it did, I'm real sorry, and I'm going to go get a millstone. But if it didn't and you liked it, then you should give us some money on Patreon, patreon.com/themagnificast. The semester is almost over for Dean and I, and we've had some extremely busy weeks in the past. But up on the horizon is the summer, and that means we have time to do more stuff. So this summer you can expect probably some more things out of us Patreon-wise, so definitely worth subscribing to us on Patreon and like keeping an eye out for the good content that we are planning on producing. Cool. You should also check out the joint retreat between Friendly Fire and Christians for Socialism. You just Google Friendly Fire and you can definitely find a link to that. It's coming up soon.
And so the Catholic Worker.
Sorry, what? Oh, and Catholic Worker too, right. Yeah, they're part of it. That's dumb. I shouldn't forget them. Cool. So you should go to that and meet all of those good people that you probably only know on the internet. Yeah, great. And thanks to Amaria Armstrong for our intro music, and thanks to Logical Spoon for our outro music. And I don't know. See you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.